Assalamu alaikum. I'm Professor Dr. Hayder Mubarak. This is a presentation for the ventricles of the brain. Starting with the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles are bilateral cavities, each of them lying inside a cerebral hemisphere. Each lateral ventricle is formed of a central part, which is called body of lateral ventricle. And from this central part, there are three extensions, which are anterior horn, inferior horn, and posterior horn. The body or central part of lateral ventricles lie below the corpus callosum, inside the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. And the body is limited anteriorly by the interventricular foramen of Monro, connecting the cavity of the lateral ventricles on the right and left side with the third ventricle. Therefore, the anterior horn of lateral ventricle extends in the frontal lobe anterior to the interventricular foramen till the genu of corpus callosum. The inferior horn extends downward and inferiorly from the body into the temporal lobe, while the posterior horn extends backward into the occipital lobe. You can see that the anterior horn and the body and the inferior horn form C-shaped cavity or C-shaped configuration. Starting with description of the body or the central part of the lateral ventricle, this part is located inside the frontal and parietal lobe of cerebral hemisphere. It is limited anteriorly by the interventricular foramen of Monro. Section into the body, as this coronal section shows that its roof is formed by the corpus callosum, while its medial wall is formed by the septum, pellucidum, and fornix, and the floor of the central part or the body of the third ventricle is formed by the thalamus medially and the head of caudate nucleus laterally, and in between the two is the stria terminalis and thalamostriated vein. Remember this figure in the presentation of topography of cerebral hemisphere. The fornix lie below the corpus callosum, and between the fornix and the corpus callosum is the lamina called septum pellucidum. And this is the lamina, which is a single lamina called septum pellucidum, and the fornix, body of fornix, forming a boundary between right and left lateral ventricles. You can see that below the fornix is a groove or a fissure between the fornix and the thalamus. This fissure is called choroid fissure because it allows a fold of pia to pass deep to this fissure, deep to the fornix. This fold of pia is called tela choroidea, that contain a blood vessels called choroid plexus, which produce CSF in the lateral ventricle. This fold, the tela choroidea, also form the roof of the third ventricle, and also here in the roof of the third ventricle, contain a choroid plexus, produce CSF to the third ventricle. So the choroid fissure is a space deep to the fornix where there is a fold of pia matter. This fold passes below the splenium of corpus callosum, and the pia extend anteriorly till the interventricular foramen of Monro and return back to be out deep to the or below the splenium of corpus callosum. This fold of pia is called tela choroidea. It is triangular in shape. Its apex is at the interventricular foramen, while its lateral angles extends laterally in the choroid fissure below the fornix, below the body of fornix into the lateral ventricle. And this tela choroidea, as I said, contain choroid plexus of blood vessels, both in the right and left lateral ventricles, and also contain a choroid plexus in the roof of the third ventricle, and these choroid plexus produce CSF in the lateral ventricles and third ventricle. The anterior horn of the lateral ventricle lies in the frontal lobe anterior to the interventricular foramen, extending till the genu of corpus callosum. Because the tela choroidea reaches the interventricular foramen, the fold of Paya, then return back posteriorly to reach the region below the splenium of corpus callosum. Therefore, the anterior horn does not contain a tela choroidea. The anterior horn is bounded superiorly by the corpus callosum, medially by the septum pellucidum only, there is no fornix medially, and the floor or lateral boundary is formed by the head of caudate nucleus. The inferior horn, which lies in the temporal lobe, extends downward and forward into the temporal lobe. This figure shows the configuration of the third ventricle cavity, which is bounded by the red line. And you can see the crescent, which is represented here in blue, representing the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus is C-shaped nucleus, as you can see. It is formed of head of caudate nucleus, body of caudate nucleus, and tail of caudate nucleus. Therefore, you can see that this blue representation of the caudate nucleus form the floor of the anterior horn and central part of the third ventricle. But this C-shaped caudate nucleus form the roof of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Therefore, the inferior horn lying in the temporal lobe has a roof which is formed by the tail of caudate nucleus, and also with the tail of the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus is always accompanied by a stria which is called stria terminalis. Therefore, the roof of the inferior horn is formed by the tail of caudate nucleus and stria terminalis, and these are the structures forming the medial wall of the medial part of the roof. The lateral part of the roof is formed by white matter of tapetum, which are horizontal fibers projecting from the body of corpus callosum. So, in summary, the roof is formed medially by the caudate, tail of caudate nucleus and stria terminalis, and laterally by the tapetum fibers. The floor of the inferior horn of lateral ventricle is formed by many structures. Medially, it is formed by a swollen gray matter called hippocampus. The anterior end of this swollen hippocampus is called pes hippocampus. The hippocampus will be studied later on with the limbic system. It is covered by a white matter which is called alveolus, and the white matter covering the hippocampus will be collected medially to form the Inferior of the hippocampus. So the floor is formed medially by the hippocampus. Laterally, the floor is formed by the collateral eminence produced by the underlying collateral sulcus. You can see that the caudate nucleus tail and the stria terminalis accompanied it, and into a structure that will be studied later on, which is called amygdaloid body. And here you can see that this is the tail of caudate and this is the amygdaloid body. It lies in the temporal pole and it will be studied later on. So the floor is formed of the inferior horn is formed by the hippocampus medially and the collateral eminence laterally. The posterior horn that lies in the occipital lobe has a roof, which is superior-lateral roof, formed by the tapetum, the horizontal fibers projecting from the body of corpus callosum, or the trunk of corpus callosum. While the floor or the medial wall of the posterior horn is formed by two swellings. The superior one is called the bulb, that is produced by fibers of the forceps major projecting from splenium of corpus callosum, and below this bulb, the medial wall or the floor is formed by another swelling, which is called calcar avis, produced by the calcarine sulcus. This is a well presentation for the inferior horn and the posterior horn. You can see that the floor of the inferior horn is formed medially by the hippocampus. The anterior end of the hippocampus is called pes hippocampus. The hippocampus is covered by white matter, which is called alveolus, that is collected medially to form the Inferior. And you can see that the Inferior form the crura of fornix. And these structures will be studied later on. So the hippocampus form the medial part of the floor of the inferior horn, while the lateral part of the floor of the inferior horn is formed by the collateral eminence produced by the collateral sulcus. While The floor of the posterior horn is formed by the bulk that is produced by the forceps major fibers from the splenium of corpus callosum and by the calcar avis, which is produced by the underlying calcarine sulcus. Starting with description of the third ventricle. The third ventricle is a single cavity of the diencephalon. And when we say diencephalon, it means thalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus, epithalamus, which is the pineal gland, metathalamus, which are the medial and lateral geniculate body. The third ventricle is bounded laterally by the thalamus above and hypothalamus below, and in between them is the hypothalamic sulcus. The hypothalamic sulcus extends from the interventricular foramen anteriorly till the aqueduct of midbrain posteriorly or inferiorly, which is called the aqueduct of Salivius. You can see that the right and left thalami are connected by a gray matter, which is called interthalamic connexus, number 1, noted here. But this gray matter connection of the right and left thalami is not a functional connection. It is only an anatomical connection. You can see that the third ventricle is bounded anteriorly by the lamina terminalis, which extends from the inferior commissure to the optic chiasma, while posteriorly the third ventricle is bounded by the pineal gland and its stalk, the lamina of its stalk. The roof of the third ventricle is bounded by the fold of pia, which is called tela choroidea. We said that the pia mater folded below the splenium of corpus callosum, extending anteriorly till the interventricular foramen and return back. And this fold is called tela choroidea, which is a triangular fold. The apex is at the interventricular foramen, while its lateral angle passes below the fornix of corpus callosum into the right and left lateral ventricles, and it contains a choroid plexus of blood vessels and that produce CSF, and it is lined by ependymal. So the roof of the third ventricle is formed by the fold of tela choroidea, the central part of the triangular tela choroidea. The inferior wall of the third ventricle is formed by the following structures from anterior to posterior. First, the optic chiasma, then the infundibulum and tuber cinereum of pituitary gland. More posteriorly are the medullary bodies of the hypothalamus, and more posteriorly is the posterior perforated substance. There are extensions or prolongations from the third ventricle, as you can see. Number 1 of this prolongation is this one, is called infundibular recess. Number 2 above the optic chiasma is called the optic recess. And number 5 here is called pineal recess. Above it, this is the suprapineal recess and else. Now we will describe the fourth ventricle. Of course, the fourth ventricle is a single cavity. It is bounded anteriorly by the pons and upper medulla, which is the open medulla, while the fourth ventricle is bounded posteriorly by the cerebellum. The fourth ventricle continues above via the aqueduct of midbrain with the third ventricle, and inferiorly the fourth ventricle continues with the central canal of the medulla oblongata, then the central canal of the spinal cord. But also inferiorly, the fourth ventricle is connected with the subarachnoid space of the cerebellum medullary cisterna magna, and the connection of the fourth ventricle inferiorly with the subarachnoid space is by a median foramen called foramen of Magendie and bilateral foramina, which are called foramina of Loschka. The floor of the fourth ventricle is called rhomboid fossa, and structures forming the floor of the rhomboid fossa, the floor of the fourth ventricle, had been extensively described with the presentation of the brainstem, and you must go to the presentation of the brainstem for more details of structures forming rhomboid fossa according to this figure. But now we will describe the lateral wall of the rhomboid fossa, which are the lateral walls of the fourth ventricle. Superiorly, the lateral walls of the fourth ventricles are formed by the superior cerebellar peduncles, while inferiorly the lateral wall of the fourth ventricles are formed by the inferior cerebellar peduncle, but also by the cuneate tubercle and gracile tubercle. The roof of the fourth ventricle is formed above by the superior medullary velum, which is this one, extending between the superior cerebellar peduncle. So the roof is formed superiorly by the superior medullary velum, while inferiorly the roof is formed by another fold of pia, which is called tela choroidea of fourth ventricle. That is not related to the first tela choroidea. Here there is a fold of pia mater lined by ependymal, contain choroid plexus of blood vessels, which is called tela choroidea of the fourth ventricle, that produce CSF into the fourth ventricle. And this lower part of the roof of the fourth ventricle contains the median foramen of Magendie and the bilateral foramen of Loschka. The fourth ventricle contains recesses. Here we may see the lateral recesses that ends laterally by the foramen of Loschka on the sides, and there is a medial recess that extends into the white matter of the cerebellum. Finally, we have to discuss the cerebral, the CSF circulation, the cerebrospinal fluid circulation. We will divide the CSF circulation into input and output. Input is first from the choroid plexus and the lateral ventricles, that is in the lateral angles of the tela choroidea. This is a major site for production of CSF. The CSF from the right and left lateral ventricles pass through the right and left interventricular foramen of Monro to the third ventricle. More CSF will be produced by the choroid plexus and the tela choroidea at the roof of the third ventricle. The CSF collected in the third ventricle passes through the cerebral aqueduct of Salivius in the midbrain to reach the fourth ventricle. More CSF will be added to the fourth ventricle by the tela choroidea and choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. And then the CSF will pass downward into the central canal of the closed medulla and then spinal cord. All it will exit out of the foramen of Magendie and the bilateral foramen of Loschka to the subarachnoid space. Later on, the arachnoid granulations and the superior sagittal sinus are projections of the arachnoid matter into the superior sagittal sinus that will allow exit or output of CSF back to the venous blood. And also the CSF in the central canal and subarachnoid space of the spinal cord will be drained by the radicular veins. Thank you very much.